Hi, everybody. Thank you for your patience. And again, welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Allison Fitzgerald Kojak. I am a correspondent at NPR News and the 112th president of the National Press Club. Again, if you have a moment and haven't checked your cell phone, please take this opportunity to do so. Almost 40,000 people were killed by guns in the US in 2017, which works out to about 109 people every single day. And those numbers don't even approach the story of gun violence in America, because beyond those 40,000 bodies, or those 40,000 funerals, thousands more people are injured by gunfire, and even more are left traumatized by the loss of a loved one, or the terror of being close to the violence. It's a problem that sparks plenty of debate and passion and activism, but very little progress and few solutions. And even if you're someone who's never witnessed gun violence up close, we've all experienced it through the news media. Wall-to-wall coverage on television, blaring headlines, and photos of mass shooters on our front pages. But that coverage is evolving as journalists have begun to rethink our approach, especially to covering mass shootings, to get away from the risk that we journalists are amplifying or perhaps even glorifying gun violence. So tonight we're going to take a look at how two fine journalists here have approached covering gun violence in very different but complementary ways. John Woodrow Cox of the Washington Post was a 2018 Pulitzer Prize finalist for feature writing for his deep and varied coverage of a 2017 school shooting in Townville, South Carolina, that really didn't make national headlines the way many of them do. And Cox's Post colleague, Wes Lowery, who is also a Press Club member, was part of a team that won a Pulitzer in 2016. He was only 25, which we all view with envy. For national reporting, the team created a comprehensive database of police shootings in the US. So we're going to talk about the issues, we're going to talk about the approaches to coverage, and Wes and John are going to talk specifically about their work. They're going to each take a few minutes to present their work to us, and then we'll have a conversation. So Wes is going to start?
Perfect. Yeah, I'll start off, and to be clear, the delay is completely my fault. As it turns out, the piece you've been procrastinating writing for several months, the time to do it is not right before a public event. It's not the best time to crash and get all your writing done. I've learned that lesson now. But first of all, thank you all for having us here today. This is obviously a really important subject matter and something that is facing a lot of every newsroom, right? We know that America, more so than any other industrialized nation, deals with gun violence and has to grapple with both this as a public health and societal problem, and those of us in the media have to grapple with how we cover these issues. I couldn't have imagined when I first got into this career that so much of my time and so many of the moments I still think back to throughout my career would have been about covering, in one way or the other, gun violence. I've, for the Post, done a lot of work around issues of police shootings, but outside of that, have been on so many teams covering mass shootings and spent a year last year covering homicide in America, which is largely an epidemic of gun violence. One thing, before I get into some of that work that we did last year, I found very helpful recently in thinking about gun violence is there's a book out right now called Bleeding Out by Thomas Abt, who's a former official in the Obama Department of Justice and I think now is at Harvard. But he talks about America's gun violence problem as 4 distinct crises. And I think that's something that was really valuable framing, so much so that I remember it and can now riff on it here on stage. 4 distinct and concurrent crises, right? You have the crisis of urban gun violence, which actually makes up the vast majority of gun violence. You have the crisis of domestic gun violence, which is a major component. You have the crisis of gun suicides. And then you have the crisis of gun mass shootings. And I think that framing is important to think about because I think about the projects I've worked on, John's amazing work, other work we've done at the Post and by other colleagues at other places, so often work that delves into one of those crises is held as a stand-in for covering the entirety of it. And I do think we need to stop and think very often about how all of these crises speak and talk to each other, right? That there is a great piece to be done on gun suicide and what that looks like. And there's excellent work to be done on domestic violence with guns. We did some of that work in our project last year, right? Obviously, mass shootings are a major part of it, and obviously urban violence. But sometimes we flatten all of it into the same idea and the same concept. And journalistically, but also even just conceptually, that's very difficult to think about all of these very different things that perhaps have different solutions, different stories to be told, different journalistic methods. To flatten them into one is probably not the most productive. What I was going to tell a quick story about some mass shooting coverage, and then I wanted to switch over to urban violence, which is what I've worked on most closely, most recently. I never would have imagined that I would have spent so much of my career covering mass shootings. Newtown happened when I was in my first job out of college, a fellowship at the Los Angeles Times, and was on for the first time of what has been far too many times a victims team, covering and calling systematically the families of all of these people who had been killed. And I, frankly, even then, as a loudmouth 22-year-old, thought that there seemed to clearly be problems about some of the ways we were doing this. I didn't necessarily feel the best. I felt, are we harassing these families of these children? Is this the right way to go about it? Should there be some type of pool? Should there be, how do we best tell these stories? And my solution to that, and those are, frankly, questions we still ask in the industry constantly. We're still talking about all the time. What's the best way to cover these stories? And so me being a brat had my little protest, and I'm not calling any more family members of these kids. Like, this is insane. And so they put me on what was live blog duty. It was my job to read the coverage of every outlet that was there to see if there were any leads, any people we should call, what's everyone else's coverage. And so I remember reading, I think it was the Wall Street Journal had a live blog at the time, and they had done an interview, a quick man-on-the-street interview with a woman who lived in Newtown, Connecticut, who said that she knew that her son went to Sandy Hook Elementary School and knew one or two of the children who were killed from the bus stop. And I thought, all right, that doesn't seem unethical. She didn't lose any loved one. She's probably not being harassed. Let me call her. So I call her, and I get her on the phone, and I very often have no idea why any of the people who talk to us, but she started talking. And what I found out was that, I always get this wrong, I believe the Sandy Hook kids were primarily second and third graders. Her son was a first grader and had severe school anxiety. Hated going to school, hated the bus, was scared of school. And so he had all of these meetings with the teacher, or with the principal of Sandy Hook Elementary School. He had all of these meetings with the school psychiatrist of Sandy Hook Elementary School, trying to figure out how to deal with the school anxiety. But the only thing that worked was that one day, while he's having a tantrum like a first grader, doesn't want to go to the bus stop, doesn't want to go down there, and his mom's dragging him along, two girls who lived down the street said, "Wait, are you scared of school? That's silly, the school's awesome." And they invited him to sit in the back of the bus with them, these cool older girls. And some days they would show up with their dog to pick him up and walk him to the bus stop if he was scared. And I'm talking to this mother, and she says, all of those people are gone. In Sandy Hook, the principal was killed, the school psychiatrist was killed, and both of those girls were among the victims. Here in this small town where the entire nation had descended, and the story that would define Sandy Hook, Connecticut probably our entire lifetimes. She had a first grader who had quarantined in the basement at this point for 3 days, trying to figure out, how does she tell her son, who is already horrified of school, that every person who made school safe for him has been murdered in their school? So I wrote that piece. It was one of the first times in my career where I realized that, and felt in some ways, proud that this seemed like an important story. It had a context, it had a nuance. And that story became part of this major Alex Jones conspiracy. The Sandy Hook truthers became convinced that this kid didn't really exist, that this mom was one of the actors. She herself was kind of traumatized, did some follow-up interviews where sometimes she didn't say things in the best way. And it became part of this massive thing that unquestionably did harm in the long run. And I tell that story only to try to like underscore the depth and the nuance and the complication of this coverage and of these stories. That sometimes, certainly as newspaper reporters, we say, well, this is how we've always done it. This is how we always will do it, right? And that makes sense, and I understand why. But it's a reminder to think about, both in the short term and the long-term impacts. I wouldn't go back and undo that story. It was an important story. It mattered. I also probably should follow up and do another story about what's happened since. And so those are just things I think about, right? Time and time again, as you know, like I said, Sandy Hook was the first mass shooting I covered, and then there have been so many since then. Very often, unfortunately, like I said, I end up on the victims' teams. Very often there is a script of how this works, the stories we have to do the first day, the stories we have to do the second day and the third. Unfortunately, at a place like the Post, we have a weird kind of shadow staff. When something like this happens, certain people pop up because we're the ones who do this type of thing. But I do think we want to think about, on any one of these stories, how do we find stories like that? How do we find stories of real people that help us break through the routineness of these? That tell human stories in ways that aren't just body counts, that aren't just, that don't fall into cliche, which we do all generally kind of do sometimes. We write about the same things over and over again. How do we find things that can break through a little bit differently? That's mass shootings. On urban violence, I think we face a similar set of challenges, right? Every city in America deals with homicide, and not most non-cities, right? So every suburb deals with it, every rural area deals with it. Homicide is the issue that we have the most media saturation about. If you turn on the television and pick the random channel, chances are you'll be watching a cop procedural about homicide. Most of our movies are about murders, most of our television shows about murders. We've seen all of the tropes, we have a sense of certain storylines, and so it prevents challenges for us as a media collectively. What is our role and what is our job? I think that there are a few things. The first is that I do think that there is a vital importance in documenting and applying pressure to what is the greatest crime someone can commit against someone else. I was talking to someone today, and I'm still stunned. I guess I'm not stunned anymore, but dismayed at the reality that most people who are murdered in America, the details of their murder will never really be reported. That part of that is because of the gutting of our local media, that decades ago, much less centuries ago, every small town had a newspaper that was fully staffed. And what that meant was that if there was a murder in that small town, there was a reporter attending the trial of that murder. My great-grandfather was murdered by the sharecropper who he worked for in the early 1900s in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina. And the local paper has detailed coverage of the trial. This was a black man being murdered by a rich white guy in 1910. And I know word for word what happened in the courtroom. Most people who are murdered in America today, the kid who's killed in Chicago today, no one will show up to that murder trial. None of those details will be written down. They will theoretically exist in theoretical court files somewhere. But let me tell you, I just got a transcript for a murder trial in Sacramento that happened 5 years ago, and it cost me $700. The idea that these court records and these police records will just be available in perpetuity to the public is something that is lacking. I think we all have to collectively grapple with. What does it look like when so many of these things aren't being written down? But beyond that, what is our role as journalists at a national level and a local level to apply pressure to these stories and to ask different questions, to break out of the tropes? And so I say that, and I'm gonna get up. I think I need to go over here. I want to briefly, and then I will shut up and go to John, who is one of the most beautiful writers at the Post and has done some extremely important work on these things. I wanted to talk briefly about the project we did last year called Murder with Impunity. And this was a project that, again, of the 4 crises, looked specifically at urban gun violence, right? People being murdered in the 50 most deadly cities in America. And what we looked at was we didn't want to do a story that just chronicled and calculated all of the deaths, right? That just talked about whether murder is up or down. But we wanted to look at the idea of justice, right? To murder another human is the greatest crime you can commit against them. One of the chief promises that a government makes is that it will keep you safe, but then also that if you were the victim of a crime like this, that you and your family will receive justice. So, how effective, at a time when murder is at historic lows, how effective is the government of the United States at procuring the justice that people are owed? And could perhaps a systemic failure to do that be driving a lot of the mistrust that we see in communities across the country, right? If you live in a community where you feel as if the police are harassing you, they're stopping and frisking you, they're kicking you off of your stoop when you're listening to music and drinking, and drinking out of a brown paper bag, but then when your cousin is murdered, they never arrest someone, how legitimate are the police in your neighborhood? You feel both overserved and underserved. So we knew from the reporting we were doing about this kind of conceptual frame. And I also always credit one of my former editors at the LA Times, Julie Ovi, who wrote a beautiful book called Ghetto Side that speaks to this exact issue. She says that she thinks the biggest civil rights issue of our time is the systemic failure to solve the murders of black men. Right? We talk very often about the murders of black men, but the government has an obligation to arrest the people who do it. And if in the vast majority of cases it does not, what does that say about what we as a society believe about the value of black life? So we launched on this project. It was both a storytelling project and a data collection project. And I always say, I'm very happy and proud to work at a place like the Post that has the resources and the time to do this, because this stuff is complicated and difficult and frankly expensive. A lot of us spent a lot of time doing nothing else. We got in records fights and spent money and then got more records fights. But what we wanted to look at is we wanted to say, and I started my pitch for this project where I said, I want to find the block in America, the corner in every city in America where statistically murder is legal, where if someone is murdered, there is no chance the person is arrested. And a lot of my editors were like, oh, are we sure do you think that's true? What's going to happen? And then we started getting the data back. We went to 50 cities, we filed records requests, we wanted a decade of every single homicide and whether or not someone had been arrested for that homicide. And the other thing we wanted was the addresses. We wanted to be able to map them so we could look at this geographically. And what we saw very quickly was that this started to play out. We'll get into this a little more deeply, but this is a neighborhood in Indianapolis. And in the 10-year period, there had been, if we count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 homicides in this neighborhood, and only one of those homicides had resulted in an arrest. So that means, I'm not a mathematician, but the vast majority of homicides, no one was held responsible. Functionally, murder was legal in this neighborhood during those 10 years. What we saw as we kept diving in, the way we did this, right? So we took, this little thing's interactive. We took 52,000 homicides over those 10 years, and we mapped every single homicide and to see if it was arrested or not. Then our very smart team, led by Ted Melnick, doing some math stuff that I will never understand, created a formula where we were able to basically create an algorithm where we could group these homicides neighborhood by neighborhood. So at any point in the map, we could tell you exactly how likely, based on all the homicides around you, if you were murdered there, would someone be arrested or not? What we quickly found was proof of concept, right? What we saw, so first, this is our areas that are low arrest. If I remember correctly, that was fewer than 33% of homicides resulted in an arrest, 1 in 3. We shaded in orange. What we also found in many cities was high arrest areas, places where if someone was murdered, there was almost always an arrest. Very often that's the downtown of a city. It's the places where the tourists are. It's the richer and the whiter areas. Right? And then we started looking city by city. There were places like Baltimore and Chicago where in the vast majority of places where homicide happened, almost no one was arrested. There are 2 Chicagos. There's a Chicago where many people are murdered and no one is arrested for murder. And then there's a Chicago where almost no one is murdered, and if there is a murder, there's almost always an arrest. And so you have to think about the compounding factor of that, right? We very often think about citywide statistics. There have been 200 murders in the city this year. Well, if 150 of them are in a 7-block radius, and the other 50 are across the whole rest of the city, those are very different experiences. We found that it wasn't true that the police just couldn't solve murder in places that are hyper-violent. some of the roughest neighborhoods of Atlanta, the public housing complex in Richmond, Virginia, the vast majority of their murders were solved. Someone was arrested. And so it spoke to this idea that it's just not simply true that some places are so violent that the cops can't do anything, right? There must be some delineation here. And what we also found was there are cities where there isn't a geographic correlation, where it's kind of, you look at that San Antonio map, it's a little small, but like, it looks like someone threw up on the map, right? There's not big chunks of orange and big chunks of blue. You go one block away and it's a high arrest zone, and another block away it's a low arrest zone. And so it speaks again to this idea that there are places where there aren't full neighborhoods where things are so hopeless that tons of people are being killed and no one is being arrested. I wanted to highlight this, and then I think I got the other one up. Open. What this looked like, so this is our full database. Eventually we added 5 more cities. So we ended up doing 55 cities, more than almost 55,000 homicides. And our top line numbers here were that look, roughly half of the homicides don't ever result in arrest, right? That you've got a 50-50 coin flip shot if you murder someone of being arrested. And that's before you begin factoring in any demographics, who the person is, who you are, how good the police are or not. And so I wanted to raise this because, this was a project that empowered us, the data work empowered us to do, and so what we ended up doing is we published all the maps. It empowered us to do a level of granular data work city by city that was valuable. We saw reporters across the country in each of our 50 cities using our maps, using our data, all of which we published, and we'd get on the phone with them and we'd walk through how to use it. And it allowed them to use and tell stories in their own markets that they otherwise could not have. Beyond that, and this is true of policing broadly, it allowed comparative. One of the reasons this blew up was because it gave a ranking. Reporters in Chicago knew that the police in Chicago never solved any homicides. They didn't know they were the worst. And that was a spicy headline for them, right? Reporters in Cleveland or in Detroit might know that this isn't great, but they don't know they're in the bottom 5 of 50 cities. And so it gave a new context for different questions to be asked. One of the things I was most proud of with this project was that we had police departments who were calling other police departments who were ranked higher in the list and asking them how they did their jobs. And so the goal here was to, how do we illuminate and provide new information that otherwise was unknowable? All this information, all this data, all these maps, we got from the police. So we haggled for the records. Eventually we got the maps. But in so many cases, the police departments would call us afterwards and say, now that you cleaned the data up and made all the maps, could you send it back to us? We couldn't do this analysis before. Now that you did it, this would be really valuable if we could see it. And so what I think about, and I'll say this and then I'll shut up for a little bit. When I think about the role of the media and the press and how we should think about stories on these big topics, right? There's been no lack of ink spilled on urban gun violence. There's been no lack of ink spilled on mass shootings. I think one of our challenges as reporters is how do we do coverage that is going to advance this conversation? How do we collect and create and publish information that was otherwise unknowable, as opposed to just recording the things that have happened today? Because that context is what helps us understand and in fact mobilizes our readers and empowers our own public servants to make real change and do real things. And that's the work I think we've been trying to do at the Post, certainly through the projects I've been involved in. And that's also one of the things I love the most about the work that John's been doing over the last few years on mass shootings is that it has provided a contextualization about these news events we see all the time. It's allowed us to understand the actual scope, the actual depth, because without understanding that, we can't even begin to have conversations about how we change it. And so now I'll be quiet for a little bit.
Thank you.
That was great, Wes. And that last point especially about context, I think is, that's what we add. Like so much of gun violence coverage, the worst of it is without context, and especially about shooters, which I'm sure inevitably we'll talk about tonight. But, You know, I've covered gun violence for 3 years at the Post, almost exclusively. And last year, wrote all about school shootings. Year before that, I wrote about individual children, and that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I can talk a lot about policy and legislation and those pieces. And I do talk about that in a book that I'm writing now, and I hope you all will buy one day. But tonight, briefly, I'd like to talk about the one thing that I always know in stories that makes a difference, and that's deeply reported, well-told, empathetic pieces that reveal the reality of human suffering. Those pieces never get old, and they never stop affecting the way that people think about the world. And I do hope that nobody here thinks that just because there's been so much saturation on this topic that we've covered it enough. Because if there's one thing that I've learned in these 3 years of doing my work and reading Wes's work, it's that we've just begun to understand the impact of gun violence. It's not thousands, it's not those 40,000, it's literally millions. It's the kids who are too afraid to walk to school every day without a weapon, which I'm telling you, 4 miles from here, you go across the river, kids walk to school with weapons, and they hide them in the bushes, and then they go inside, and at 3 o'clock they start to get nervous because they have to walk home again. We don't understand at all, and I didn't understand until I started doing this work, that this is a public health crisis. That's what this is. A few years ago, my editor at the Post, Linda Robinson, had a big idea, and the idea was I had written some about kids in traumatic situations, and she said, why don't we do a project about the impact of violence on children in America? And that quickly was narrowed to focus on gun violence. And we still had a challenge, though, and the challenge was how do you tell that story in a way that people haven't heard over and over? And the way we did that was to tell the stories through children's eyes, which I hadn't read very much of. You always read stories if a child's harmed or if a child's a witness, you hear it through the parent, through the teacher, through the social worker, the psychologist, the police officer, but rarely do you actually hear the child's voice. So that year of work that I did in 2017 really changed the way that I viewed journalism and changed my life, really. I went to Cleveland and spent time with 4-year-old Carter Hill. This was within a week of a shooting. He was shot in the head in a road rage incident. And you know, you wouldn't think that a 4-year-old could articulate what that was like, but he could. He described to me what it felt like to get shot, the car chase, what it felt like to lay there in a hospital bed. He could describe all that. He could describe what it was. I went to Las Vegas 2 days after the mass shooting there and followed 6 teenage girls who survived the attack. I spent weeks in Southeast DC with a boy named Tyshawn McFadder, who was a 2nd grader, whose father was killed in a gang shooting in the middle of the day right outside of his school. That day, he walked by the lobby and looked out the window and saw police lights flashing and thought, I hope my daddy's okay, because he knew his dad lived down the road. I spent 2 weeks in West Chicago with teenagers who were just trying to not die, literally just trying to survive. I read hundreds of text messages between a 16-year-old girl and her best friend in the days before he was shot to death in a suicide by cop incident in Virginia. And I also immersed in the lives of 1st graders in South Carolina many months after a school shooting there in which a teenage boy pulled up to the playground and opened fire on a group of 1st graders. And these stories drew a bigger response and I think changed more minds probably than any work than I've ever done in my career. And there was no sort of magic formula for how I got these stories. People ask a lot about how do you tell stories about little kids who've gone through trauma. We can talk more about that process tonight. But I want to share just some big lessons that I've learned in these 3 years of reporting that I think, whether you're a journalist or you do any sort of anything in life, I think are helpful because they've been profound for me. And the first is always go and always stay. I say this all the time, mostly to myself, and every journalist has debated this, is do I have to get on that airplane? Do I have to go knock on that door? Do I have to go to that funeral or that vigil, or do I have to go ask that question? We've all done it. Anybody who's been a cops reporter or covered anything difficult, you always don't want to do that. But the answer is always yes. Always go, always show up. If you can go instead of picking up the phone and making a phone call, go, always. Because your presence, the difference that makes for the person behind that door is the difference in the story happening or not, in my experience. And I'll give a small example. Like I said, I'm working on a book that expands on a couple of the children in this series. And this is Tyshawn at his father's house. That's a bullet in the front door that he came home from school one day and found that. So I was this was about a year after his father was killed. His family was holding a school supply drive. This was last summer. And I had had a really long week of reporting and really didn't want to go, but I went. It was a Saturday, and I would have rather have stayed home and hung out with my wife, but I went. And then I got there and nothing happened. I was there for hours, and there was just nothing going on. It was loud. I couldn't hear anything he was saying. It was just a waste for 3 or 4 hours. And then I kept thinking, should I go? Should I just give up? Should I go home? Should I go home? And I just kept staying. And then toward the end of it, Tyshawn and his friend decided, let's go to the pool up the street. And so I thought, okay, I'll stay and just walk with them a couple of blocks up the street. And as we're leaving, these 2 9-year-olds start to talk for the first time about their personal experiences with gun violence. How one of them had found a gun in his father's drawer one day and played with it and could have killed himself. How the other one had a raid in his home and had an AR-15 pointed at him. How they each dreamed about living somewhere else. They had all these places they imagined that they would live because they imagined that those places didn't have guns. And I had to tell one of them that Texas is a place with guns, which was disappointing. But the point that it illustrated for me is I was so close from missing that moment, which was among the most profound reporting moments of my life. Just walking with 2 9-year-olds, describing how every piece of their life was framed by gun violence, and how through 9-year-old eyes they imagined changing that down the road. And if I hadn't gone or if I'd left early, I would have missed that, and I wouldn't have known it. But there's no regret in always showing up. So the second is when you do go, either go there first or go there last. I've always found that if you're the first one there, and no offense to any of my TV colleagues here, but always beat the TV reporters if you can, because it gets a lot harder. And I'll give one small example. It's from the Las Vegas shooting. That night, I started looking for any evidence that there had been children at the shooting. This was that Sunday night. And on Monday, we learned through a tweet, a high schooler had tweeted that 2 of her friends who were classmates, they were twin sisters at this school, had both been shot. And then through that, found their names, and through that, found the mother's name, and then with the mother's name, finally found a Facebook page. And I sent her a message and said who I was, and I sent her a piece that I'd done before. She was at the hospital messaging me. And I said, can I come? And she said yes. So I got on an airplane the next morning with no idea if they would let me into the hospital, no idea what I would get. But when I got there before any other media did. I got to them before any other media did, and they led me to the principal of the high school, and he led me to 4 other girls who had been there that night. And it happened to be that this week was their homecoming week. So 4 girls, all juniors, the 2 girls who were shot were both seniors, but the 4 others were juniors. And this should have been the greatest week of their high school life. And so I followed them through classes, through the football game, through the pep rally, and I was standing there on the dance floor at the end of the week. And the access that I got only happened because I got on an airplane with no idea what to expect, but I just went. And the other side of that is, like I said, if you can't go first, go last. A lot of the best stories that I've done, especially around gun violence, and Wes can speak to this, people move on from these so quickly. And it's not just the media who moves on. I've heard time and again, I'll go to these communities and they'll say, their relatives, the schools in the next county will say, are things back to normal now? Have you moved on now? And things never go back to normal for them. They never move on. And what happens is after there's this crush of media and attention and people sending them letters and stuffed animals, everybody moves on and they quit asking questions. So I've gone sometimes a year after, and the desperation to talk to me, often in towns, small southern towns where the Washington Post is not the most popular publication, and every door is open. And it's because you are this person who cares. So much of what we do is just caring. And that leads me to my last point. And this is usually the first tip I give around reporting, especially reporting around trauma or gun violence. And that is to be human first and a journalist second. The first thing I do, and I learned this when I was a cops reporter in Florida, and you knock on that door if somebody, you've just gotten the police report or heard over the scanner that somebody's dead, is you tell them you're sorry. You know, that's the first thing I always do, is I tell people that I'm sorry and I mean it. And you know, the day that I don't mean it is the day that I should quit. Because if you can't immerse in somebody's grief, if you can't feel it with them, you can't go tell the story the right way. You cannot honor their story the right way. So I cannot emphasize that enough, is that we have to be human first. And people can tell, you know, they can always look at you and tell if you care or not. So the last thing I'm going to do is read an excerpt of one of the pieces that I wrote in 2017. It's a story that is about these first graders in South Carolina. Bill asked if I would read an excerpt from this. And to set it up a little bit, I'm not going to read the beginning. There was a 14-year-old named Jesse Osborne who one day he walked into his dad's bedroom and pulled a handgun that he knew was in his dad's, next to his dad's bed, that his dad thought he didn't know. And he walked downstairs and he executed his father, and then he got in the pickup truck and drove to his old elementary school, pulled up and opened fire on a group of first graders. And this is a shooting that you have never heard of, in all likelihood, because only one child died. And in modern America, that is our measure. If not enough children die, then people like us don't get deployed. We don't go, because we somehow think that the trauma is related to the body count. And these things happen so often that that's what we've come to. So I went, and my editor wanted me to go there for that reason. Is this was a shooting that people didn't remember. So I'm going to start with a section that begins with Jacob Hall, who was 6 years old when he was killed. He was the smallest boy in first grade in Townville Elementary. And the story largely focuses on the kids he left behind, all of whom I'm going to read about. Colin, who was shot in the foot, but he survived, as well as Jacob's friends Sienna and Carson, and also Ava, who loved Jacob more than anybody. So. A week later, on a Wednesday morning in October, Jacob lay inside a miniature gray casket topped with yellow chrysanthemums and a Ninja Turtles figurine. He was dressed in a Batman costume. Ava couldn't bear to look at him, so she sat on her mother's lap near the back of Oakdale Baptist Church and turned away. She called him Jakey. He was the only boy she'd ever kissed. 19 days before he was shot, she had written him a note. "Come play with me, please," she scribbled in pencil. "You can play with my cats. Do you want to get married when you come? My mom will make us lunch." At the bottom of the page, she'd drawn herself in a pink dress, standing next to a bespectacled Jacob, who appeared about half her height. "I love you," she added beside a red heart. After the shooting, Ava realized she'd forgotten to give Jacob the letter and crumpled it into a plastic bin in her bedroom. Now she was at his funeral. "He's not really dead, is he?" she whispered to her mother. "Yes," Mary Olson told her, "he is." Jacob's family had asked that people attending the service dress like superheroes because of the boy's infatuation with them. Ava wore a Ninja Turtles top with a purple cape. Sienna and Colin, who was still in a wheelchair, both dressed as Captain America. Carson had also come, his shirt displaying a J with a Superman logo, but he'd hesitated in the parking lot. "Mama, that looks like that boy's truck. Is he here?" Carson had asked, motioning toward a dark pickup. From their seats, the children listened to the same pastor who presided at the funeral for Jesse's father 3 days earlier. They watched as midway through the service, Jacob's mom staggered to his casket, then collapsed to the floor. They stared at his body was wheeled up the center aisle at the end of the memorial. Then, just hours after their friend's funeral, they returned for the first time to the place he'd been shot. The school, scheduled to resume classes the next day, hosted an open house that afternoon. No one knew how the kids would react, but Fredericks, the principal, believed the small step of a brief return might help with the big step of a permanent one. In Townville, where nearly 7 in 10 of the school students live in poverty, it wasn't viable to construct a new building or bus them elsewhere. They had to go back. When they did that afternoon, some kids even returned to the playground. Colin rolled out on his light blue medical scooter. Sienna climbed a playset, but Ava lingered behind with her mom. "Please don't make me go out there again," Ava said, before they eased onto the sidewalk, holding hands. With each step, the girl's fingernails dug deeper into her mother's skin. "What if he gets out?" Sienna asked her parents in the days after the shooting. Then she never stopped asking. They explained that Jesse was in jail, that she was safe, but still, Sienna obsessed over him coming for her again. Next to a sign behind her top bunk that read, "Night, night, sweet pea, sweet dreams," she relived the shooting in her nightmares. Fredericks and her staff did all they could think of to ease the kids' dread on that first full day back, October 6th, when all but 10 students showed up for class. They were welcomed by uniformed officers, therapy dogs, volunteers in superhero costumes, more than 20 counselors, a line of signs, "Have a great day at school," in the parking lot. For Sienna, though, each morning included a negotiation with her parents. "I don't want to go to school today," she would say. "I don't feel good." At drop-off, she would search the parking lot for the cruiser of the police officer assigned to Townville Elementary after the shooting. She needed to know he was there. One day, Sienna announced to her mother, Mary Lee, that she couldn't go to summer camp anymore. "They don't have a police officer." Like many of her classmates, loud, unexpected sounds petrified her. Once, outside of Publix, a car backfired, and she dropped to the ground before dashing inside. Another time, after a balloon popped at a school dance, the entire gymnasium went silent as the principal rushed to turn the lights on. Fredericks later banned balloons at the spring festival. "Noises are different now," she said. Sienna and her friends began carrying stuffed animals as a form of protection. In those first days back at school, she would slip a tiny pink teddy bear named Lovey into her pockets and squeeze it when she walked into the playground. Even at home, she lost her sense of security. Sienna, whose mom is earning a master's degree at Clemson and whose dad runs a business, lives on a peaceful cul-de-sac in a 2-story house that overlooks a lake. Sienna would deadbolt the front door when no one was looking, and at the sight of unfamiliar cars, she'd scurry inside. One afternoon, she stood in her bedroom as Mary Lee ran her fingers through the girl's shoulder-length brown hair. Sienna again thought of Jesse as her dark eyes fixed on a pink heart taped to the wall. Are they going to let him out?" she asked, her finger picking at the decoration. "Nope," her mother said. "Ever?" Mary Lee didn't want to lie. She searched for the right response, still stroking her 7-year-old's hair. "Not any time when you're still a kid." A month had passed since the shooting, and Carson was beginning to sleep and eat normally again, but a sense of guilt still haunted him. "Maybe I should have waited for Jacob," he told his mother, Kayla Edmonds. "He could have jumped over the fence with me." She insisted that he could have saved Jacob's life, but Carson couldn't be convinced. He'd stood half a foot taller than his friend. The big kids were supposed to help the little ones. The trauma had left him with intense separation anxiety. He'd followed his mother, who worked at Subway, when she stepped out for a smoke, and he had profound grief. He'd known Jacob since they were toddlers. They'd bounced together for hours on a trampoline. They giggled together playing Grand Theft Auto, the video game with the bad words in it. When Jacob died 3 days after the shooting, Carson's mom didn't tell him right away. It was his 7th birthday, and they were celebrating at Chuck E. Cheese's. On their way home, he asked yet again if Jacob was getting better. In that moment, she told him his friend had gone to heaven, and Carson began to cry. After that, he didn't like it when people mentioned Jacob's name. For Valentine's Day, Carson wrote a card in his memory. "I loved him, but he died, but he is still alive in my heart." I'm going to stop there. So, I came away from that with two takeaways from that story. And one was that I had never been more convinced that this was a public health crisis, that gun violence is a public health crisis. This is a school shooting that we don't remember. Imagine Parkland. Imagine Sandy Hook. Imagine these places where kids lose a dozen of their classmates. This was one kid, and it was the title of this story was 12 Seconds of Gunfire, because it was over in 12 seconds. From the first shot to the last, it was 12 seconds. And then you imagine kids in Southeast DC or Chicago or Baltimore who, somebody said this to me the other day, that it's like for those kids, like the way that DC felt during the DC sniper, it's like that every day. There was an 11-year-old shot by a stray bullet 2 weeks ago. Yeah, right. And over the weekend, 7 people got shot. You know, this is a daily occurrence, and you know, our country has failed, especially children, because it's the kids who, like Tyshawn, who lose their fathers, and it's the kids who lose their best friends, like the kids in Townville. So, thank you.
Kind of hard to follow that up. I want to ask you, John, because I did read some of those stories, and then I saw that you went back to Ava.
Right.
A while later, she had written a letter to the president. Can you tell me, one, how you stayed in touch and how that story came about?
So, you know, Ava is one of the 2 kids central to the book that I'm writing. And so I've continued to report on her ever since. I talk to her mom almost every day, and Tyshawn is the other who's in the book. And, you know, they're both still deeply traumatized. She is on her 7th therapist. Ava's on her 7th therapist right now. You know, and this wasn't a kid who was physically injured. You know, so I realized in this reporting that we often focus on 2 things, the shooter and the people who get shot. And forgotten is everybody else. You know, I talked to a survivor from, not to stray, but I talked to a survivor from Columbine, a woman who went on to be a psychologist. She got her doctorate. And she lost friends, and because of that, she wouldn't get therapy because she felt survivor's guilt. She didn't feel like she deserved it. Sometimes, and this was true in Las Vegas, the girls who got shot dealt with it better than the girls who didn't, because they had a physical wound that would heal, and they actually had attention. They got attention in the way that nobody else did, because it was, oh, you made it out, fine, you're fine, great. You know, those girls struggled with an inability to eat, to sleep. Their grades plummeted. I mean, it wrecked lives. And, you know, these were the people who weren't shot. So Ava was, for me, you know, she has severe PTSD and takes heavy doses of medication. And, you know, I have hope for her because she is a brilliant little girl. But, you know, those 12 seconds changed her forever. She'll never be the person that she was going to be.
And Wes, you were talking about, especially the unsolved murder situation that you were showing us, how some police departments were reaching out to others. Do you have any evidence that there were, or any sense that there were things that they could learn? Did you guys examine what different police departments were doing? Yes. And what these other departments could learn, and whether that is actually happening?
Yeah, so I think that it should be a crime to have to speak in public after reading an excerpt of John Cox's reporting. But yes. So generally, you think about policing in the United States of America, right? One of the most important public policy issues that we have. Elections swing on it. Local governments, you know, you get rid of your mayor if crime goes up a little bit, or you elect a new. I mean, it's one of the most important, and it's one thing we want. We spend most of our tax money on our cops, right, on our public safety, and yet it's a thing that we know actually very little about. What's effective, what's not, what works. That when we think about policing in America, a lot of it swings on emotion and anecdote, and not on objective reality. Right? I say that a lot when I talk about police shootings, right? We have this massive national conversation around police shootings. Are they happening too often? Are there racial disparities in them? And we had that whole conversation literally not knowing how many people were being shot and killed by the police. We live in a country where we can tell you exactly how many people have seen the new Lion King last weekend, how many of them bought popcorn, how many of them were second-time viewers, and we don't know how many people yesterday were shot and killed by a police officer?
Yeah, which is not an accident.
No. But it's stunning. We're having a big national conversation. Politicians are weighing on it. People are proposing new things, and we're doing that in the absence of actual information. That we like to believe, because we spend so much time discussing and consuming content about urban gun violence, that must not be true for that as well. Of course the cops know how to solve murders. Well, evidence would suggest maybe they don't. They don't solve most of them. And so that was really stunning. I'd never heard it articulated this way, although it's something I've believed for a long time, the either be first or be last element of it. One thing that was stunning for me, and again, maybe I should have known better, I probably did know better, but I was stunned anew, was every homicide we wrote about in that series last year happened in a major American city. We weren't uncovering secret murders no one had ever heard of before, right? These were all places that even with a decimated local press, had a local press. Most of these cases got written about to some capacity, in some ways, right? But the vast majority, and this is true of too many issues, but it's certainly true of almost all policing issues, that on a given news story, the vast majority of the journalism produced on that story is published at a time when we know the least amount of the information. That when a major crime happens, you know the least amount of information on day one, and the most amount of the information after the trial is over. But if I walk out the door today, or you walk out the door today and get stabbed on the street, there will be an article tomorrow morning about the stabbing that happened in downtown DC, and yet there will probably not be a single reporter who shows up at the trial of the person who stabbed you. A trial where every single detail of exactly what happened will come out. And so it was stunning to me, right, that we would encounter these homicides, and we had them on the map, and then we had to figure out what happened. We had to go talk to people. We had to talk to family members. And the initial coverage had none of the details in it. How could it have? The family's trying to bury their loved one or figure out how they're going to pay for a funeral or figure out even what happened. And we are coming back in some cases 10 years later, 5 years later, 2 years later, and are being drowned in all types of details and narratives and the lead anecdote for the lead piece of that series from Omaha, Nebraska was about a murder that had been written about 3 times in the local press, had been written about on an anniversary, had been talked about, and yet it had never been reported. One of the reasons this man was likely murdered was he had just won a settlement on the Judge Joe Brown show. He was an auto mechanic, and he just won $5,000 in this small town. And so he stopped by his liquor store to get his tall boy that he drinks every day when he leaves the auto shop, and a guy from the neighborhood most likely stuck him up because everyone knew he had all this money. It was the basic contours of what happened. It was the story of the murder. It had never been written down one time. The family knew it, and it had never been captured. I think that, I do think that, to actually answer the question you asked me, there are clear and obvious things and lessons that can be applied from the journalism we do, and very often, especially around, again, policing issues as it relates to violence, right? There are 18,000 police departments in the United States of America. There are 18,000 individual fiefdoms. We're the only world power that doesn't have a national police. We have 18,000 militias who make up their own rules, have their own training, make up their own best practices, and in many cases, in the case of sheriffs, are elected, not based on any qualifications or expertise, but their dad used to be the judge and everyone knows this last name, and I like that guy. And so now you're the sheriff of our county, in charge of procuring justice for everyone. And so what we found was that there is because homicide is something that's talked about and studied and obsessed about, there's all types of best practices. That they know for a fact that a homicide detective can't really handle more than 3 to 4 cases a year, because a homicide case involves, in many ways, it's a lot like journalism. You gotta find witnesses, you gotta talk to them, and you gotta go back to them, and you have to reconfirm information, and once you get a new witness, go back to the first one and see what matches up. Then if you can get a charge, if you get enough to get a charge, you have to make sure those witnesses don't disappear, they don't get killed, that they show up to court, right? You have to babysit the 12 people involved, and at the same time, hopefully are building a relationship with the family and reassuring them and providing them information. Think about, in a homicide, how many people that would require managing. Now think about trying to do that for 9 different cases at the same time. We found police departments where, on major city police departments, where on average you had detectives working 8, 9, 12 cases a year. Of course these cases were going unsolved. By the time they were able to follow, I mean, like I said, as journalists we know that sometimes you call someone on Monday and you call them on Tuesday and you call them on Wednesday and on Thursday and Friday and on Saturday, and then the next Friday they call you back. Maybe. I just got back from St. Louis, where I spent a week with a guy who I had been chasing for 3 months. Now, my job is not as important as a homicide detective's is. I think it sometimes, but it's not, right? Now, what happens when the detective doesn't have the time to follow up, to actually find the witness who was there, to talk them into talking? And so, again, what we found was that we had so many of these cases, so many major city departments with budgets of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars a year, hundreds of officers who weren't following very basic best practices. I remember we talked in Boston, which had the biggest racial disparity of any city. If you were a white person murdered in Boston, there's a 90% chance the person who murders you is arrested. If you're a black person murdered in Boston, there's a 40% chance the person who murders you is arrested. 2 different cities. And beyond that, if you're a white person murdered in Boston, you don't exist. You're statistically not going to get murdered if you're a white person in Boston. And if you're a black person in Boston, you might get murdered tomorrow, statistically. But I remember talking to the chiefs, and they have historically done a better job. They've gotten much better over time. But they said, you know, we went to London and studied the best practices there. And if someone is murdered in London, and again, it happens less often because there aren't guns like there are here in the United States, the police will send as many as 100 detectives to the scene. Oh my God. They will say, a murder in our community is a crisis. Yeah. Every resource will be expended until we find the person who committed this murder and they're arrested. And so guess what? The vast majority of people who are murdered in London see the person who murdered them brought to justice. In America, our departments don't treat that way. You get 1 overworked detective, maybe 2 overworked detectives, and they can work on this until tomorrow when they get another case. And so we did see a lot of best practices surface and a lot of questions, again, because these become such localized issues without the ability to compare. What's Boston doing compared to Detroit, to Chicago? A lot of times, like I said, I'd get on the phone with a police chief or homicide commander, and they would be asking me questions about what other departments did. And I would go, good God, like, because this is horrifying, that I know, objectively know more about what the state of play, the best practices of solving homicides are than the homicide commander of insert city. And so we got like I said, there's a federalism issue there, there's a guns issue there, and there's a data issue.
So I want to bring in people's questions in a moment, but first I'm going to ask John a follow-up. I think we have a microphone over here. If you want to ask questions, please say your name and who you are. But first, I'm going to follow up. So Wes just talked about the failure of police to, even be trained on how to solve homicides, and therefore the failure. You earlier said we are failing these children. I assume this is part of it, sort of being able to kill people with impunity. But where else are we failing the children? I mean, there are public policy issues. And there are family issues. Can you talk about what you've learned on that issue?
Well, that list is hundreds of items long, but 2 things that are always easy is we haven't studied gun violence in 2 decades because of something called the Dickey Amendment. The CDC has not studied gun violence for 2 decades, since the late 90s. And what that did is it was a senator from Arkansas who included language in the budget that's passed every single year that says the CDC basically cannot promote gun control. And what that did is it sent he didn't intend this, but it sent such a chilling effect through the CDC that they don't study it. They don't. This is a thing that kills more kids than cancer now. And the CDC doesn't study it. So that is, if we had studied it in the same way that we studied, let's say, auto accidents, and consider the number of people per capita who were being killed by cars in the 40s and 50s compared to now, and that's because of research. And Dickey, before he died, changed his mind. And part of what changed his mind was he looked over the little 3-foot barriers on the highway and realized, oh, that was research that led to that, because that saves tens of thousands of people's lives every year from head-on collisions. That's one obvious thing. Another way that we're failing children is we have virtually no laws that mandate people lock up their guns in homes with kids. That would save literally thousands of kids' lives and would save tens of thousands from getting shot by their brother or their cousin or their friend. And there's virtually no punishment because often the local prosecutor, again, we have no nationalized system, will say, well, they've suffered enough. They've suffered enough. But they're not even educated enough. That person isn't even educated enough to know that I should lock my gun up. Because I taught you'll hear always, I've heard this hundreds of times, I taught my kids gun safety. You cannot teach, this is a fact of science, they've studied this, you cannot teach a kid to not be curious. They will always go get that gun. They've done studies on the percentage of parents who think their kids know where their gun is, and the disparity is massive. And then they've also asked, has your kid ever played with your gun? The disparity is massive. And it's just a moment away from that kid turning that gun the wrong way and pulling a trigger, and it's all over. So those are, I could go on, but those are two obvious ways.
I mean, as a health policy reporter, I've
Right.
done those stories about whether gun violence can be considered a public health problem. And the problem is many people say, well, the answer is always going to be get rid of guns.
But
and nobody believes
yeah.
that there's interim, at least, solutions to minimize.
Right. We're never going to ban guns in this country. We're not going to be Australia. We're not going to be New Zealand. But if we could reduce the number of homicides or the number of people killed by guns by 10,000 a year, would that be worth it? Yeah, that would be worth it. We'd still have over 20,000, but we'd have 10,000 more people alive every year.
No, and I say this a lot in our coverage and in fights with editors about various parts of it, but like a life is a life.
Right.
Like one person
Right.
is a massive story, a massive change. Right? And so I think very often we do think about these questions in these very divorced statistical ways. Like, if this policy change saves one life, is that worth it? Right. And I think that framing and the way that we're looking and talking about this would often change, especially here in the city where we are, where things are very partisan and very political, and there's a tendency to talk about, well, the reality is, well, Mitch McConnell would never allow, well, who cares what Mitch McConnell would do tomorrow? In terms of the moral question of what we should talk about or how the story we should write, but more often it should be divorced from the quote-unquote realities of our partisan politics.
And that was part of the motivation to write about kids, is because we knew nobody can blame a child for getting shot. You can't rationally do that. People often get blamed, especially in urban environments. It was their fault. They were involved in this or they were involved in that. So we can dismiss that. You cannot say that about a child.
Good evening. Name is Jamal Abdulalim. I work as education editor at The Conversation, but I'm here in my capacity more so as a freelance writer who occasionally writes about gun violence. Before I ask the question, I want to say thank you for doing this. You spoke about victims, the trauma of survivors, to a certain extent perpetrators, and then the investigations and what doesn't happen. One thing we haven't heard much about is the stories of the guns for themselves. Yeah. For every shooting, there's a gun, and for every gun, there's a story of how that gun went from the store or wherever it originated to the place where it was used. And I think there's a reason that in a lot of the reporting, we don't really see a whole lot about the stories of guns. We do sometimes, but one of the reasons is because Congress has passed a law, I think it's known as the T-Art Amendment, that basically keeps or restricts gun trace information to law enforcement strictly for the purpose of criminal investigations. Makes it very hard for reporters to get information on the history of a particular gun. I'm hoping you can speak to your experience with learning about the stories of the guns themselves, and also offer some tips or advice on how reporters can work around some of the restrictions that we have in terms of getting information on the history of crime guns. Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm writing that chapter right now about guns, and you know, it is really difficult. It's really difficult. I mean, I've spent the past. I tried to get the gun that killed Tyshawn's father, which they've had for a year and a half since March of 2017, I just wanted to know what state it came from, and they won't tell me. They won't tell me that, just the state. I don't want to know who sold it. I don't want to know who it went between. Can you just tell me the state? And they won't. And I mean, those laws are written in a way intentionally to make it really difficult because they don't want blame put on anybody along the path, right? So the Trace has done really great work on this. They did a recent big investigation into how easy it is now to just steal guns from dealers. That people now will go in and steal a few hundred guns, and then those guns, flood the market. Because the gun dealer has no responsibility to actually protect their weapons. There's no sort of fine. There's no, hey, you're going to spend a year in jail if you, don't put things behind lock and key or make some sort of menial effort to keep them safe. So it's a really hard thing to do. I mean, the best thing I can tell you is you got to make, you have to develop sources at places like the ATF and with local police. I mean, they know, and if you can develop background sources at those places, they will sometimes help you. My colleagues, our colleague Peter Herman just did a great piece tracing, the title of the piece was One Gun, and he traced all the different shootings that this gun had been used in because, people will, gang members especially, they will often carry guns for protection, but there is guns that are used for killings that are communal guns often. That the gun I know that was used in Tyshawn's dad killing, the shooter had been incarcerated at a time when that gun was used in another shooting. So there is really important work to be done around trafficking, around straw purchases. I mean, that cannot get enough coverage. And I think the Trace at this point has done really the best work that I've seen.
I think they've done the best. Now you mentioned Peter, he did another piece relatively recently, and it was a piece about a gun trafficker in DC who brought the gun that ends up killing his cousin into the district.
Yeah, his teenage cousin.
And his means of, I remember talking to him throughout the reporting process, and he finds this essentially, you have to find him to get the actual deed, but he finds the story essentially through an inadvertent federal court filing, and then had to haggle with them for months to reconfirm out the very basic details, right? Someone had mentioned this offhandedly, an ATF agent had mentioned it offhandedly in a search warrant and it speaks to, and again, a lot of this is not wanting the culpability of people along the way, the political fear that information about who has guns, where they come from, will eventually lead to some database of where all the guns are, and therefore people can come take them from those people. Again, so much of our public policy conversation is completely colored and influenced by the political fears and debates around this issue, objectively to our detriment in terms of knowing the contours of what is a public health crisis.
And the charge for trafficking 200 guns, it's operating a business without a license. There is no trafficking charge in this country. So you can traffic a pound of cocaine and serve 30 years, or you can traffic 2,000 guns and serve a maximum of 10 years in prison. And that is by design.
Thank you. I too would like to thank you for your work. My name is Mike Evans, and I work with a tutoring program in the DC public school system. And I don't know if many people know this, but virtually every school, certainly every high school, has a whole phalanx of metal detectors in the schools. And in addition to that, the students, in some of the schools, they scan all of the students, and they will always scan guests or uninvited guests. And in Chicago, by full disclosure, I was born, raised, went to grammar school, high school, and college in Chicago. In Chicago, there are certain neighborhoods, particularly Lawndale on the far west side, where in the neighborhoods and in the individual homes, families have, I'm from a generation where we had air raid drills and all that kind of stuff. In the families, and in the homes, they have family drills. If they hear a sound, the children and the families know which corner of the house to run to, what level of the floor, they need to fall to in order to save themselves. And I would just like to ask you if you have experienced or encountered those types of scenarios, and has your investigation informed you in any way about how public policy is developed to address that particular problem?
Yes is the short answer. That reminds me, when John was reading that excerpt earlier, one of the things that I thought encapsulates why that's a story and why it's important to go there is the concept, the idea that there's a school in South Carolina that has banned balloons, right? It speaks to how this big, broad, amorphous idea affects our daily lives. There's a school where balloons are banned because everyone is traumatized because someone shot the school up. There's a family that is running gunfire drills in its home. What does it say about the way we live our lives, right? And how do we identify and document and find those experiences and those spaces? Because those are the details, even more so than I do plenty of data work, right? Even more so than the numbers and it's like, how is this affecting our daily and in our daily interactions in our lives? And how do we see that? There's a story that someone in the room should do before I ever do it or one of my colleagues does, but there's the fight that's currently happening around guns in schools, which has been one of the large post-Parkland pushes about having armed security guards and having people in the schools. And there's a particular debate that's happening about what obligation does the school district have to inform the parents before it puts guns in a school, because it's a gray area in the law. Technically, the school can just hire armed guards. But do I have a right as a parent to know when I drop my kid off at a school, is there a gun in that school or not? Should that have to go through the school board? Should I be informed by a letter? What happens if I wake up one day and find out there's a gun in my kid's school? Do I have any recourse to get it out, right? It speaks to the reality of the moment we're in, right? That we're having school districts that are pulling themselves apart, debating whether or not there should be a gun in the
I'm
school.
sure there are plenty of parents in this room, but I have a college-age student, a high school student, and an elementary school student. And from the time that college-age student was in kindergarten till now, you used to be able to just walk into schools. Now the kids are locked in. You have to go through the office to enter. They have active shooter drills. They know the difference between a shelter in place versus a lockdown, which I don't know the difference of, but they do. It's just amazing what is going on in the schools in terms of just creating fear, on generalized atmosphere.
The last piece I did before I went on leave for the Post, this published at the very end of last year, was how many children had actually been through real lockdowns in schools, not drills, real lockdowns. And in one school year, it was over 4 million. And we think that was maybe half of the actual number, because we went to the largest 100 or so districts in the country and asked for their data. So we're missing, huge swaths of the country. But we know just from that and from going through news stories that over 4 million kids went through actual lockdowns where some percentage of them thought for a few seconds at least that there was a shooter in their school. And we know that because we asked hundreds of them the question. So, to that question, I think it gets to some of this. We're decades from making a dent in, but what we can do today is offer better treatment options for these kids. Yeah. That's another area where we're failing children. I mean, we talk about toxic stress and the ACEs study and things like that. When kids live in such fear, even in their own home, we know that kids have a hard time learning if they don't feel safe. And if in your own home, you know where it is to hide. Tyshawn knew where to hide. I mean, because there had been so many shootings, because there was a bullet hole in his front door. He knew enough. He'd been on a playground when there was a shooting, and there had been a shooting right outside of his house. And he knew the foot of his dad's bed was the place to hide, because that was far enough from the wall, because he knew that bullets could go through the wall. So what those kids need, and every kid needs, is access to therapy. I mean, I'm a big proponent of the trauma-responsive schools, which is sort of just now building some momentum, where people on the front line, teachers and coaches, understand how to recognize trauma. This effort to no longer just suspend a kid because they're having a bad attitude. Well, maybe they have a bad attitude that day because they've witnessed some really horrible things in their own home. So restorative justice and things like that. I think that's where we could start today. You know, obviously, no kid should live in the richest country in the world and have to hide in their own home from stray bullets. But what we could do today is offer real effective treatment in schools. And as a taxpayer, I'd love to have more of a tax to fund that.
Yes. No, and again, and this is why I think this reporting is so important, because we can't solve, one, I co-sign everything John just said and believe very firmly that one of the major ways we are underserving our children, but our population writ large, is our failure to address the trauma that so many of Americans are living and experiencing. But in order to address the problems, we have to recognize them and acknowledge and admit that they exist. Yeah. And again, I think that's why, and you think about, sometimes I do a thought experiment in my head, and I think about, what if a presidential candidate said, all right, I propose a government-funded free therapy program. Every American has a right to go to whatever talk therapy they want. If they want to do it through a religious advisor, they can do that. If they want it to be wedding counseling, they can do that. Or if they just want to go talk to someone. And I think all the time about how I can hear like Fox News mocking it, right? I can hear how the political conversation would deal with, America, you guys think everyone just needs talk therapy. But because again, we collectively have trouble sometimes grappling with the difficulties with which we deal with. Again, so much of the work we do, you think about the number of students, and John thinks he got half of them who had gone through an actual lockdown. And as he notes, that doesn't count at all the times that were drills. I remember a little bit younger than John, not that much younger. And so I don't know if this was true of you, we did lockdown drills.
Yeah,
I
never did. We did fire drills.
Yeah, so because we were, it was pre-Sandy Hook, but post-Columbine. We did lockdown drills. We had phones in every classroom with emergency, like if this happens, do this.
Yeah.
If this, and I will never forget for the rest of my life, my junior year, where we have a lockdown drill that goes on for a little too long and it's unclear what's happening, and my AP World History teacher sobbing in the corner thinking the school's getting shut down.
Oh my God.
I will never for the rest of my life forget what that moment. Now, I've traumatized myself plenty of other ways since then, but I don't mean that to belittle. That was a real definitional moment in my life. Mm-hmm. And nothing objectively happened.
Right.
Parkland, one of the reasons so relatively few people were killed in that instance was they had already had a fire drill that day, and so most of the students assumed something bad was happening.
Oh, 'cause you don't have two drills.
Why would
in a
there be
day.
another drill today? Right. What's going on? People were on alert in a way they wouldn't have otherwise been. Now, one might argue, well, that's a good thing. We've trained the kids the right way. And someone else might say, we're training our high school our children to have to be so alert while they're supposed to be learning algebra and history to decipher when the fire alarm is going off. Is this a real fire or someone trying to massacre all of us?
I mean, we're training our kids to fight.
Yeah.
That's part of Alice training. The C in Alice is for counter, where they're actually teaching children to attack their shooters based on no evidence that works whatsoever. But imagine just teaching a kid to do that. Just saying, okay, when they come in, throw your book. Throw a stapler at the
speaking
shooter.
of research and evidence, there's also no evidence that locking them all in the closet and hiding in a big group works either. So it's just, all these policies are based on.
That's why the CDC should be
Somebody's
spending
good
hundreds
idea.
of millions of dollars researching it.
Next, sorry.
Chris Files, I'm a member of the Washington National Cathedral's Gun Violence Prevention Group and co-chair of the DC area Interfaith Gun Violence Prevention Network. I have two things I'm frustrated about with the coverage of gun violence and two story ideas. The first is I think 90% of journalists still talk about gun control rather than gun safety and sensible gun laws. The second is the data discussion. So 40,000 people nearly died in 2017, but 134,000 people were wounded. We are so focused on those killed, and it's not 109 people killed a day, it's hundreds of thousands of Americans every year affected by gun violence, and just draw that out, it's millions. Two story ideas, John, I'd love to see a story on the culture of gun violence and interviews with why people pick up guns and shoot. Yeah. And Wesley, I'd love to see a mapping project on how many neighborhoods in the U.S. are war zones, and how would we define that? Is that 100 shootings a week?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for the work you do and for those ideas.
that's a good idea. Because I can tell you that there are absolutely neighborhoods in this country that far outpace, I mean, Southeast being among them. I mean, that's a tiny part of the country and part of the city, and the homicide rate there is much higher than it is in some, nationwide war zones, what we consider war zones,
Yeah.
or the number of Americans who are dying in places like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, and the point, both of the initial points you made are extremely well taken, and I frankly think extremely valid. As I was saying earlier, I think far too much of our conversation adopts the politics of the moment, like I said, again, especially in this town, and our media friends who work in this town. We're both sitting here Washington Post reporters. We work in a publication that cares a lot about the politics. There's a lot of conversations about but we are writing about things that affect real people every single day.
So I know we have more questions over here. I just want to, in terms of the politics, and I feel like after the Parkland shooting, the conversation started out as a conversation about gun violence, but it somehow got magicked into a conversation about school safety.
Right.
As if children were like slipping on the pavement or something. Right. And so what concerns me about this, as a parent as well as a citizen, is that we're essentially turning our schools into jails. Right. Everywhere kids walk in, go through a metal detector, and then they're locked in and can't leave. And
a lot of that's strategic, right? It's a way to deflect, is that let's not talk about the gun, let's talk about the school safety. I mean, if you look historically at the way that the gun lobby has responded to these sort of mass shooting events, or events that seem to get real sort of scary amounts of momentum, it's shift the focus, arm teachers, right? And it's the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? And what we are asking of our schools is just absurd. I mean, this is a societal problem. We are the only nation of our wealth that deals with this at this rate. The only one. And the only difference is, truthfully, is the number of guns in this country and the way that we regulate them. We don't have more evil people in this country than in Australia. We don't. There's no evidence of that. And a lot of our other crime rates are right in line. Things like burglaries and robberies, like those are in line with other first world nations like our own. So there's just, I don't know what it will take, but I know that if we started with research, if we had hard evidence, because in fairness to gun owners and to even the NRA, we don't have the evidence in a lot of cases. There are some things we know. We know that background checks, universal background checks would save lives. We know that making people lock up their guns if kids have access to those guns would save lives. But there's a lot of things we don't know, like the evidence around AR-15s and weapons of mass destruction, which is what you could argue that they are, extended magazines, things like that. We don't have a lot of evidence to say, oh, if we banned that, it would save lives or not. And so that's, to me, the foundation of change is you have to have the evidence to say, and that's exactly what think about tobacco. They denied for years that caused any harm to people. And then there was irrefutable evidence and everything changed. That's what it's going to take, I think, when it comes to gun violence.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm from Texas Christian University. I'm studying philosophy and political science. So we've talked a lot about homicide regarding gun violence. I'd like to mention a little bit about suicide with gun violence, especially regarding schools and children who become mass shooters of their school because they're so unhappy, they've been so stressed, they've been ostracized from the community that they feel anger outwardly and inwardly. They're shooting up their school with intention to kill themselves afterwards. Yeah. So I guess my question is, do you have any suggestions? How can we better the education system? How can we make our students more informed and more inclusive towards one another, not just making treatment available for after, but how can we prevent these things from happening in the first place?
I think that kind of going back to the idea of we can't address things we can't name and talk about, I think one of the things that's difficult for us both as a media and as a country to grapple with is the fact that we are a nation in the midst of a mental health crisis, collectively. When you look at our suicide rates, when you look at the rates at which people are traumatized, when you look at and it's exacerbated by all the things we do talk about all the time, about economic anxiety, about racist bigotry, about it's exacerbated by all types of the societal forces. And yet what it means in its collective is that we are collectively suffering from a mental health crisis, a crisis of not providing care and access to care. You pull in your Obamacare discussion if you want. You can pull in the old history around how we deal with mental health nationally, and closing a bunch of the centers, which some of them were not serving people the way they should have been or not. Right? That there is a collective conversation about what mental health care looks like, and we have that conversation on the back end. We have that conversation after Nicholas Cruz shoots at Parkland. We have tons of conversation then about mental health and who was this guy and what should have happened, right? But less conversation about why is a teenager in the richest country in the world in a position where they have such untreated, unaddressed mental illness that this is the end result. And this permeates every part of our conversation collectively. Healthcare, economics, police shootings. 1/3 to 1/2 of the people who are shot and killed by a police officer are in the midst of a mental health crisis when they are shot and killed. And we do have an epidemic of suicide by cop. I know of a case of a guy sitting in his backyard holding a gun who calls 911 and says, I want a cop to come kill me. I have a gun. And so the cops have to respond because someone has just called them and said they're in public with a gun. And so the cops show up and kill the guy. Door-to-door service. And so we have to think about, again, the collective of what it means. And I think that is not just about our children, it's also about their parents and it's about adults. But again, too often I think sometimes we frame these issues in ways that are a little too small and don't get to the extent to which, like I said, the mental health crisis we're dealing with nationally affects every aspect. And guns are a major, again, in a world in which we didn't all have access to them, we wouldn't have the level of gun suicide that we do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, 60% of those nearly 40,000 are suicides. I mean, a huge percentage. And but that doesn't mean they have to happen. You know, people think that if a person can't get access to the gun, they would go hang themselves, and that is not true.
It's objectively not true.
Is that if you don't have access to the primary method that you imagined harming yourself with, more often than not, you won't go through with it. And suicide is often impulsive, and there's a very short window, especially with kids, where it's very brief, where they intend on harming themselves. And when it passes, it's gone, often. Mm-hmm. And there's a study out of Texas that found that from survivors.
And those attempts are much less likely to succeed
exactly.
anyway if they don't use a gun.
Right, the lethality of a pill is about 10%, and the lethality of a gun is over 90%. You know, if you, this gets, though, your question gets to me to the trauma responsive, right? And what that means, for people who haven't heard of that, is it's actually training teachers, it's training coaches on how to recognize those red flags, right? So it's not just for kids who are dealing with domestic violence at home or in neighborhoods with community violence. It's also for those kids that are showing signs. Because right now, you know, I remember Tyshawn's teacher. I asked her, a second grade teacher, I asked her, and this was in his school was a charter that was pretty progressive and really had a lot of good ideas and wasn't expelling kids. And I asked her after the fact, did you have any training on trauma or loss? And she had none. This was a woman in her early 20s who was suddenly dropped with a kid who was furious, overwhelmed with anger. And she said, I did the best that I could. So, you know, we ask a lot of our teachers, but by and large, teachers want to know these things. They want to be able to recognize when a kid is exhibiting a red flag that they need to address, right, or that they need to have a conversation with them. I know that, you know, we've gotten better, but we over-suspend and over-expel in this country. I mean, every time we kick a kid out of school, they're gone. A lot of these kids who pick up guns and hurt themselves or hurt their classmates are kids who got lost, and Nicholas Cruz was among them. I mean, he was there had been a lot of people who had raised their hands about him, but he got lost in the system. And I mean, I don't think any kid is hopeless. I don't think there's any kid who, if there hadn't been an intervention, they wouldn't have done what they did. So there is a lot that we can do.
I hate to do this because we could probably talk all night, but we're already 17 minutes over, and we started a little late, so I let it go a little long. But I think we have to wrap up. I don't know if you guys want to, say anything to wrap up before we dismiss the class.
I think the questions have been great. I mean, I'm just encouraged that people are here, and that this really cannot get enough coverage. This is an issue. It is a public health crisis. By definition, it's a public health crisis, and there are so many more victims. There's a child shot in this country every hour of the day, every single hour of the day. During this conversation, probably at least two kids on average have been shot. And that doesn't speak to the adults and fathers, right, and uncles and mothers. So this can't possibly get enough attention. And I would just say don't quit, That's the way I look at this. This issue at times feels hopeless, but it's not. It's not. And states have made individual progress, and journalists have made progress, and collectively, societally, we can, but you can't quit, even though it feels frustrating.
Of course. And just to very briefly build on that, I do think that we have to, I heard an activist who I write about, I heard him say this once, and I think about it very often, but we have to dare to be willing to imagine the world we want to live in, and not be defined by the contours of the world that we do live in. And I think that's come through I've caught it in small ways. John and I have both framed these things, right? When you talk about raising the question of, well, in the richest country in the world, should this be true, right? If everyone else can to not have this reality, why does it exist here, right? Again, I've said this a few times, but there's an inclination very often among journalists to pride themselves in kind of being pragmatist, to be know-it-alls. Well, that's never going to happen, or this would. And what if, on these important issues, we just dispensed of that? John said earlier, and I don't actually disagree with him, but he said, we're not going to get rid of all our guns and not become Australia. Well, what if we did? I once, in having this exact conversation with a good friend of mine who's another reporter. She grew up in Salt Lake City and from a much more conservative family. And she said, we would just never do that. We would just never do that. And I said, well, how many slaves do we have today? Because I can bring you to a time in history where this was equally insane of an idea, right? It was equally unique and structural and societal. And today there are zero. Now, again, there are all types. I can make a very strong argument against myself here. And there are realities. But I do think as the people charged with telling stories, and more importantly, as the people charged with asking questions, we can't cut questions off of our list because we're too pragmatic to do it. We should be asking questions like, well, what if we did just get rid of all of them? Because if we're unwilling to ask the questions, then certainly no one else is. I'll put one more plug in. I think I've mentioned like 7 books while I've been here, but after Parkland, I saw a Twitter thread from a writer and a reporter, and he noted that the gun violence conversation reminded him a lot of the conversation around regulating airlines. The book he wrote, and I didn't realize this till I read all the way into the book and got to the acknowledgments and realized that my book editor was the editor of this book, which is why it was so good, I assume, right? But the book is called The Skies Belong to Us, and it's a narrative history of plane hijackings in America. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was a plane hijacked basically every day, and it was the type of thing that, much like school shootings and gun violence, what would we ever do about it? This was one of the most powerful lobbies in the world, armed with this massive technology no one understood, that Congress wasn't really in a good position to regulate. These people can fly you in the air like a bird. How are we going to tell those people what they should do? At the time, you bought your airplane ticket after the plane had taken off. It was like it was a train. There was no security, there was no metal detectors in airports, and big airplane was not going to allow any of that to happen. It was going to cut into their profits, it was going to make air travel more difficult, and frankly, who cares if once a week a plane gets hijacked? We pay $1 million, we get our plane back. They don't usually kill anybody, so it doesn't really matter. And they literally had congressional hearings where the transcripts read like a gun violence transcript would have. It's all mealy-mouthed excuses about all the things they cannot do and how they never could actually, like this pie-in-the-sky idea of regulating air safety. I don't know if you guys have flown anytime recently, but we no longer buy our tickets after the plane's taken off, right? And not that I love all the air security as someone who travels a lot, but I read that book, which is, like I said, is a very beautiful book and worth reading, and it's this excellent kind of narrative journalism of a societal problem that felt like it was too big to solve that got solved. And I just think, and I look to accounts like that and to journalism like that to try to think about, are we asking the right questions, and are we willing to, like, are we daring to dream big enough about maybe what the world could look like for our kids, much less our grandkids?
Well, we'll call it there. Thank you very much, John Woodrow Cox, to Wes Lowery for being here. It was really a pleasure. I think.